Now, do you want me to?
Well, thank you for joining us for this session, and it's going to be focusing on James and Catherine Hassall, and it's the 27th of August of 2022. My name is Graham Hassall, and I'm the current chair of the Hassall Family History Association. I'm going to just share screen and introduce the association and its goals in brief. And then I'm going to hand over to the facilitator of this session, the convener of this family line, Roland Hassall. Now I'm just going to find a way to share the screen here and make a start. So you should be able to see now the first slide, which is showing the origins and purpose of the Hassall Family History Association. Basically, this association exists to foster and disseminate research on the life and heritage of Roland and Elizabeth Hassall and their descendants. But we're also interested in their connections to other early settler families in New South Wales and the Australian colonies. And we're not just interested in the past, but we're interested in how the Hassall family experience can help us think about culture and innovation into more recent times. Now, Roland and Elizabeth had 9 children. 8 of those lived to adulthood. Poor Elizabeth died in infancy at the age of 2, but that left still 4 sons and 4 daughters, each of whom married and had children. And today we are focusing on the 5th born, James. Now, these 8 children of Roland and Elizabeth, between them had approximately 62 offspring of their own, of whom approximately 50 married into other early families, so the 50 spouses. So by the 3rd generation, there's quite a large number of people to follow in a family history association. James and Catherine had 10 children. We're having a series of these meetings online to bring together members of these families to explore not only the origins of the family in Australia, but up until through the generations, to learn more about our connections. We're also interested in a number of projects associated with this family, and one we call Hassall Heritage Locations. And that is an attempt to identify the geographic locations that were important to each of these family members. That might be land grants or buildings that remain in existence, and also their resting places, so that we can attend to their burial sites if possible and if necessary. So James and Catherine, of course, are part of that heritage. They lived in a number of locations in New South Wales and Victoria, and they're buried at Coleraine in Dandenong.
No, sorry. Can I correct that, please?
Yeah, correct it now.
Coleraine is a country town in the Western Districts of Victoria.
Yes.
And Dandenong is a suburb, an outlying suburb of Melbourne. They don't go together.
Oh, thanks very much. So that's the whole point of clarifying the material that we have.
And in 1990, my son and I went to Coleraine and cleaned the grave, not the headstone, the slab that goes over the top of the grave for James and Catherine.
Very good. Thanks, Roland. And well, you can talk more about that in just a moment. So that's great. Just a few more things about the family, about Roland and Elizabeth. There's a chart here that shows their early life in Coventry, in England. A brief period in Tahiti, which they're perhaps most famous for, but it was a brief period in their life. But when it comes to looking at the raising of the family, we see that it's the 22 years in Parramatta, in the case of Roland, and another decade after that in the case of Elizabeth, where they had their children, raised their children, had a family, focused on this house in George Street, Parramatta. In brief, not to go into detail, but the children were born at roughly 2-year intervals, between 1794 with Thomas and Elizabeth being the last in 1810. And in this session, we're looking at the life of James, born in 1802. We find that Roland passed away 1820 at the age of 52. James was age 18, and his mother passed away in 1834. So he lost his parents at a relatively young age. This is the dates at which the other siblings were married. There's a famous triple wedding, and then a number of other marriages. And we see James's marriage. And so, Roland, sorry, you may go through some of these things yourself, but just to put in context, that James, the fifth born, but the last to marry, which means that none of the grandchildren got to meet their grandparents, Roland and Elizabeth. And I just did a little bit more homework here. This is the longevity of the family. Poor Elizabeth, who drowned at 2. There were another 3 of the children, or 4 of the children who died before the age of 40. And then there were 4 who lived from James's age of 60 up to Susanna at age 84. So they were in the more long-lasting of these siblings. And then finally, to do with the grandchildren, I mentioned that James and Catherine had 10 children. This is the 62 grandchildren of Roland and Elizabeth. And when we look, we're not looking at the detail now, but just to give some context, and this is to do with the passing of those grandchildren. I've highlighted the 10 grandchildren of James, and it seems that the last of their grandchildren was a George who passed away in 1942. And it seems to me that grandchildren of George might still be with us today if we were able to find them. So that's in brief about the family and some of the projects. We are trying to publish where we can, the newsletter and booklets, and we are actively engaged in research using old publications, official publications, looking for images where they exist, whether portraits or photographs, looking for grave sites, and as I've already mentioned, looking to restore them where possible, commemorating sites. We're also interested in genealogy to get the accurate data about the family connections using software. And we have a transcription project because there's 8,000 pages of the Hassall family papers in the State Library of New South Wales, up there with the other papers, say, by the MacArthur family and James Cook and Banks. But they're not the only papers in the Mitchell Library, because there are at least another 86 manuscript collections, notably the papers of Thomas and Eliza Hassall, which are a totally separate collection of papers that the library purchased in 2015, which we haven't even explored yet. And behind all this interest at this current time in having these family line meetings is an event we're having in May of 2023, where we're trying to bring the family together to celebrate being part of this early settler family, and also to learn more about our connections and to meet up with our relatives. So that's a bit of an overview of the association. And I'm going to hand over to Roland now, who's a convener for this family line, but it was also part of a group 25 years ago that held a Hassall family reunion. And well, Roland, I'm handing over to you, and you can initiate some discussion and tell us where you think this project of bringing together the James and Catherine line may go. It's really over to you what you'd like to discuss with us.
Well, I've spoken to cousins of mine, and the starting point for us was to get together our 5 families, but also to try and involve our grandfather's brothers' children. And I only really know one of them, and I haven't been able to meet with my cousins to find out if we can locate any others. But we've also got some, like Julie is the descendant of Auntie Sheila, who you may recall was the person who designed the T-shirt that said "Many Hassalls, No Problems," that we sold at the reunion 25 years ago, which was quite a humorous little T-shirt we had. but those cousins too, there's sons and daughters there, and those female lines have sort of disappeared into the mists a bit. And that, I think, goes back further than just our generation. See, George was our grandfather's grandfather, Julie, or father? I think he was the father, wasn't he?
Yeah, father. Yeah.
He was the father, right? And it was his son Roland who went to New Zealand and started that branch. And George called his eldest son Roland, our grandfather, after the one that went to New Zealand. And the one in New Zealand called his eldest son George after the one that stayed here because they were best buddies growing up. And then grandfather George killed himself or died in a jinker accident driving from the what's it called, Wootton Vale, the sheep station in the Western District into the city one afternoon. He appeared in the photo in the book that we had 25 years ago. It appeared that he had suffered a stroke, and the suspicion is that the horse bolted and he wasn't able to control it, and he got thrown out and broke his neck. But that's just rumour. We're not sure. But after that, the family went on the road because they didn't have enough money to keep the sheep station going. And they ended up married into a Catholic family called the McPhees, who oddly enough were the brothers who, there was a whole bunch of them who became Carmelite brothers and ended up running schools that some of our cousins went to. And so the brothers were the cousins of the kids that they were teaching, which was a bit interesting from time to time, especially when some of the students weren't as good as the teachers thought they should be. But that when I was 19, I went to New Zealand and reconnected with the relatives over there. And they had married into a family line, into a Maori line over there, and had quite a network of cousins up and down the North and South Island. But that's a long time ago now. And that's about as much as I know about our family at the moment.
Actually, one of the questions Graham asked was, are there any grandchildren left? And there are two. There's Tom and Barbara, who are grandchildren of
George.
George.
And Tom's 96, isn't he? And Barbara's 86.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to see Barbara on the way back from this trip at
Where
the
are
end
you
of
then?
next week. Me, I'm at a New South Wales coast called Womboyne.
Okay.
There's Womboyne Lakes. Can you see it there behind me?
Oh, yeah, lovely. Yeah.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
It's pretty good. It's nice to have good friends. Yeah, it's lovely. Of course, they're all in there having their afternoon glass of wine while I'm joining you. So that's it. Sorry?
You're privileged, that's all.
That's right. And I don't drink anyway, so I don't understand it all. Julie, have you got anything that you could add to that?
Sorry, what was that about you not drinking?
Yeah, no, I don't drink.
Okay. Well, I invited all my siblings, and yeah, only Linnell replied. She is my brother Joseph's daughter, and she sounds quite keen actually. She said, "I won't be able to make it today, but I'm happy to help with any organising or admin. I love a good spreadsheet, and I've organised several hundred people for the work Christmas party while keeping my sanity just."
She sounds like someone we could use. The biggest thing that
I'm grabbing it. What was her name, Julie?
Her name's Linnell Cogan.
Linnell. Oh, we're going to. Okay, we'll just.
I'll email you her details later.
See, it's the small connections that make a big difference in the end.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that there were two of the grandchildren of George who are alive. And that's like finding gemstones, isn't it? So we find that the older generation had photo albums, and they remember what's in those photos. And if the effort can be made by family members to ask them, do you still have old photo albums? Do you have any letter collections? because often the younger generation aren't interested in taking them on. So we're
Yeah.
interested in these types of things.
That's where I was hoping that Katrina would join us today. Katrina is Tom Hassall's daughter, youngest daughter, and she would have been able to help with that. But I'll be in touch with Katrina after today and catch her up on that.
I'm pretty sure you went to Tom and Hazel's 60th wedding anniversary, did you?
Did, yeah.
Yeah, remember they had like hundreds of photo albums out. Not hundreds, but yeah, lots and lots. So they definitely have a lot of photos.
Yep. Well, I've got I've got at least one of Dad's old photo albums, mostly of his years in the Air Force. So,
Yeah.
But the thing that's really bugging me is how do I find the other cousins? Like our cousins, our direct cousins from Roland, who was the eldest son, is pretty easy. But the others, we'd have to track them down. And I used to know where some of them lived, but they're a generation that's gone now.
I remember that you used to meet with some of them on the first Sunday of December.
December, yeah. That was David Hassall, the Victorian David Hassall, who wrote the book. His family met on that. His father died during the year.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So my mum was friends with him because they were first cousins.
That's right, yeah.
Well, I've got some news about David J. Hassall because I saw him here about 3 days ago. And,
that's good.
And he's on assignment up on the Sunshine Coast, writing about some motor car. And but he's hoping to get to the reunion next year. And so he's on board with, because he did so much in the past, writing the book, doing some research. So he's on board.
Did he send his research to the lady who wrote the next book? I've forgotten her name.
Jean.
Jean Stewart.
Jean Stewart, yes.
He came to visit me to give me 2 boxes of material.
Righto.
But he kept some back that he hadn't yet fully scanned and used, which was his immediate family. But he gave me some old photos and letters and essays and things, which I haven't had time to go through. He also gave me the booklet on the Hassalls of Mount Ubi.
UBI.
Yeah, this one.
Is that right? UBI?
Yeah.
That's out in central West Queensland, isn't it?
Yeah.
And which of the children did they come from?
I think it's from one of the children of James.
Okay, so they're an ally, Roland.
Yeah. What happened was that James went to Queensland first before he overlanded to the Western District in Victoria.
I didn't know that.
And there's someone up there who was married to a woman called Frances Rowe. And there's still some Hassalls out there that I thought I might meet up with when I went to Winton and Longreach earlier this year. But I didn't run into any of them. And I looked in, you go and look in the local telephone books to see if you can find anyone there, which is what I did around New Zealand and what I did up there, but I couldn't find anyone. That book, Graham, could you, on the Hassalls of Mount Ubi, how big is it? Did you say David had scanned it?
No, I didn't say that.
He might have, though.
David Hassall, do you have this book?
Yes, I've got that. Yes,
he's got everything.
It should be on my list. And those folk, they were very interested in the event that we had in 1998, and we had some tension because they wanted to be on the committee, or one or two of them did, and so we very politely resisted that because we were already underway with the committee we had, and but they produced their own book. Obviously,
they came to the meeting in Canberra, didn't they? Some of those people.
I can't remember the details. I think I talked to them on the phone a lot. I can't remember meeting them.
Well, I think, Roland, where your question was going is that how big is it to copy? You won't be able to find copies in a secondhand bookstore. It'd be so rare.
Yeah.
So we should make copies and maybe contact them and see if they're happy for it to be reproduced.
Yeah,
And I'm sure they'd be happy about that.
looks like Uncle David's got his copy there.
Yeah. So this process is it's a process of just finding what materials exist, who knows what, who's got stories to record, and particularly photographs. And you see from the Facebook page, a lot of family members are putting their photos on the Facebook page and getting in touch. And this slowly builds up into a sizable body of research and material.
I think we've got I've got to get your help, Julie, to work out how we contact everyone else. I struggle with things like Facebook and whatever those other things are. I mean, I've seen some stuff on Facebook, but do you use it at all, Julie?
Yeah, yeah. I'm a bit like you. I'm a slightly older generation. I think it's a bit modern, really.
All right. Well, we'll just have to try a bit harder. Excuse me.
Now,
actually, that's one thing. That's one thing Linnell was probably excellent at. Actually,
good point.
Roland, I'm just wondering whether you've ever had the time to read what Jean Stewart wrote about James.
No, I thought I got her book too.
Mm-hmm. It's a few pages, and again, this is out of print now. We've got to work out what to do. But James really had a very eventful life, and he experienced the highs and lows. He was very successful with his businesses, his farming, and he was very active, just like his parents and his siblings, very active in civic life, political life, commercial life. And then had a big crash in the 1840s and came back to humble circumstances and went to Victoria. But he's one of the, I think if I've read it right, he's one of the early Hassalls who was held up by bushrangers. And there might be a little story to be written about how many of our forebears were held up by bushrangers and what was the result. But I think that's in there as well. So it was these guys really experienced life. It wasn't a sedate existence that they had, and I think we might be able to interest members of the family in this remarkable story.
I've actually got a coin holder that's stopped a bullet from a bushranger in New Zealand for the one of the Hassalls over there.
Is that right?
It was a flint container, and it was in his top pocket, and the ball hit it and didn't go through, luckily. It's one of those things I've just got sitting on a shelf somewhere at home, with all these books like, in old Australia and Voyage to the South Seas, etc.
Yeah.
Because Dad had quite a collection of stuff too.
So you haven't, these stories that James is walking down probably a street in Sydney, and he passes Governor Macquarie, and Macquarie says, "Can you read?" And he says, "Yes, sir, I can write too." And the governor says, "Good. Well, you write me a letter and I'll give you a piece of land."
That's right. That was that farm out at Camden.
Well, that's the good old days, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he later bought Jonathan's farm from him when Jonathan's failed.
Yeah. We visited that. David J and I visited that. And there's a picture in that first book of me and the owner of that farm. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we've got to do is, how did you trace all the other people that you're not immediately related to for these other family groups? How did you trace them? Did you just wait for them to contact you on Facebook?
We have a number of methods. One is that we have the ongoing list of the association, and we have a research meeting in Sydney that every year someone new comes along to that who's a family member that we didn't know of. And the reason we use Facebook is that people find us They're searching. And Rosalind Vaughan is one as an example. She said for 20 years she was doing Hassall research as one of the families that she's descended from, and she didn't know we existed. And she found us on Facebook and was delighted and came along and gave a presentation. And so there's a number of ways that we find people, and it's just an ongoing. It doesn't happen in a particular month. It's just ongoing.
Yeah.
And then those people have to decide if they're interested in putting a bit of time into the family history.
Yeah, you just reminded me of a little story. I worked for the ABC, and a couple of years ago, I was at a Radio National Christmas party in Melbourne, and for some reason, I have no idea how it came up in context. I talked about some of my family arriving in 1798, and without mentioning any names, Michael Cathcart, who's one of the presenters on Radio National, said, "You don't mean the Hassall family, do you?" Mm-hmm. And I went, I almost fell over. And turned out that as part of his masters at Melbourne Uni, he had actually studied the Hassall family.
Well, thanks, Julie, because Alice knows a bit about that. Alison, do you want to fill us in on that?
Well, Michael Cathcart is my husband's cousin's husband, and I saw Michael at a family gathering at the beginning of COVID, and we started talking about the Hassalls. And Michael said that at uni he did research with his professor, and they published a book which Graham will hold up soon. And I said to Michael, "Well, what do you know about the Hassalls once they got to Australia?" And he said nothing. He only knew them about the study that they did from England and the LMS, and then getting to Tahiti. And I said, well, we could do a lot of swapping of notes, but I haven't heard from him since. So yes, same
story.
Exciting when that happens. Yes.
Yeah, I've spoken to Michael Cathcart on the phone too. He's a part author of the book about the voyage out of the Duff going out to Tahiti. And it's a very thorough examination of the whole thing and what they were thinking, what the missionaries were thinking, and what they did, and so on, and a bit about their theology and how they had differences of opinion. And it's an excellent book. It's the only book of its kind that's in existence, I think. It's a very valuable work, and so thanks to Michael Cathcart. He's a really good guy.
Do you still have contact with him, Julie?
What, sorry?
Do you still have contact with him? Oh, I suppose Alison does. Yeah.
Actually, it just reminded me of something else. Just across the road from me is a little uniting church, and they had a fete one year, and in it they had this book, A History of Tonga.
Right.
And in it, it's indexed, and I did manage to find that there are some references to Hassalls in it. It's not big, but a couple of paragraphs. Spelled incorrectly, but Mrs. Hassall, the widow of one of the Duff's missionaries, for example, it talks about that.
Oh.
Who's the author of that, Julie?
John Thomas.
Okay.
Can you see that? The Reverend John Thomas, 1797 to 1881, played a prominent role in the Christianization of Tonga.
Right.
That's what it says.
Okay. Right.
So, as part of the reunion next year, has there been any connection made with First Nations people to ask them if they were interested in perhaps conducting a truth-telling ceremony at the reunion? I know that there was a fair bit of angst about having a sorry book at the one all those years ago. I just thought it might be something that we can, as leaders in the community, we could show that it's worthwhile doing.
Look, Roland, I totally agree with that. And it's just a question of how much, who's going to do that work in the preparation stage.
Well, I apologise if it seems like a setup, but my daughter has offered to do that.
Where is she located?
In Elstonwick in Melbourne.
Why is she offering?
She's got well, she and a number of other cousins have an interest in Aboriginal history and the relationship between the Hassall family and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia.
Can we set up a discussion online, which we won't record, but just to get to know them? There are Aboriginal academics who are starting to tell their stories and writing it in dissertations. So I'm trying to keep track of that. And there's about 3 Aboriginal nations that in whose lands the Hassalls had their properties. And we may also have a relative on my father's line who is actively engaged in restoration of Aboriginal language. So there might be a whole strand of, but there is some sensitivities around it, intergenerational sensitivities about how much time we put into it. And I think this is about the future of the Hassall legacy in this country, to come to terms with
what happened.
What happened. And how we handle it. We would need to really think that through and do it well. So this is really wonderful offer that your daughter is making. So
I think Katrina was also interested in that aspect of it. She's involved with the Aboriginals from the Western District, which is interesting because she and her sister are in that area near Eden Hope, which is where the Hassall sisters, George's sisters, married 2 of the Hopes and set up in the Western District of Victoria. They had that town named after them. So there's a lot of strands to pull together if we can actually get them going. But from my point of view, May next year is not the end of it.
No.
It's just another time to get together and have a chat. And we just keep building and maybe getting the next generation to continue. Is that what you have in mind, Graham?